Hi, I'm Leslie from Deeply Southern Home, and today I'm so excited to share my wood art project with you. So I totally get it. This looks complicated. You're thinking, I can't do this. But if you can turn a miter saw and cut on an angle, I know you all these angles and all the shapes, but I'm going to walk you through every single step. The great thing about this is that it has a secret purpose. Let me show you. And the purpose of this wood art is, see, panels. Yep. This is heavy. Okay, so I'm gonna hold this up so you can see, but you see how the trim, I created kind of a recessed panel so that once it's hanging on the wall, it perfectly frames those panels. Look at a drawing of what we're going to create. There's a link below to a downloadable version of the directions and the diagram. The first step is to cut a base of plywood. For this design, you'll need a square, and I use 32 inches. Then you want to mark off a halfway point, top and bottom, so that you create 4 quadrants. Then in each quadrant, you're going to mark a halfway point. And then for that halfway point, you're going to use it to draw a line from that point to the center of the panel to create triangles. And then you'll repeat that so that you have 4 triangles, 1 at the top, 1 at the bottom, and 2 on the sides. And here's the diagram again to show you what that's going to look like. The next step is to take 1/2 inch plywood and rip it down into strips. And here's the diagram that shows you how many you need and what dimensions. With all the strips ripped down, it's time to start assembling, and you see that the base is not only what supports all of the art, but also becomes a template of where to position things. And you see how I marked the half, and then I drew the diagonal line. The tops of each strip, so the parts that they meet together, that is cut at 63 degrees, and the bottoms are cut at 27. But in order to determine the length of each one of those strips, I laid them on the plywood and then marked the bottom so that I had the distance. So you may be asking yourself, how did I get a 63-degree angle when the miter saw only cuts at 45? Well, let me show you. So just about the only way to do it is to cut a piece of wood, a nice piece of scrap that you can really clamp down on your miter saw, and cut it at 27 degrees. And then move the miter saw back to 0, and then use that template, that guide, as to cut your 63-degree angle. Here's what that piece looks like. There is the 63 and there's the 27. So I have a very tiny piece on the miter saw. I use the pusher for the table saw to act as my finger, because you do not want your finger in there. Do not. And as you cut your pieces, make sure you label each one of those triangles. So each triangle got a letter and each piece got a number. And then I added different finishes to different pieces of the wood. For the triangular slats, I used a vintage wood aging solution so that it was supposed to naturally kind of gray the wood. And then I wanted to add a little bit more contrast. So for the middle board of each one of those triangle pieces, I stained them with a mixture of Kona and bleached blue. And I wanted to do that because it would give me a dark gray undertone brown. For the wider boards that divide each triangle, I used a watered down gray chalk paint and kind of created a wash. Now it was time to finally really attach everything and assemble all the triangles perfectly. So I've done 2 sides already, and you can see I cleaned off the excess glue, and now I'm taking apart all the pieces. And with those pieces removed, you can see how I drew the triangle shape onto the base. And now I'm going to add wood glue, and then I'm going to spend a good bit of time fiddling with each one of the triangles and getting them perfectly lined up and even as best I can at the bottom. To attach everything to the back panel, I used a pin nailer, which is great because the nails holes are so small you don't have to patch or do anything to them. I used a 3/4 inch nail, which meant that some places, depending on how much pressure I applied, the nail came out a little bit in the back, but that's why I have it on concrete while I'm nailing. Now, doing these gray boards here in the center, I would say this is where the project got a little more tedious and required a good bit of patience. It took me a while to figure out how to do this as efficiently as possible, because it turned out that each one of those sections were a little bit different, the gray sections. And so I would line the board up on one side, figure out that angle, make sure it fit perfectly, and then I would define the measurement for the other side. So the measurement that I'm taking there, or that angle that I'm drawing, I'm going to end up using that angle going all the way up to the center, but it was difficult to find the exact distance or to mark the left-hand side accurately. Although within each section, the angles on the right and the angles on the left stay the same. It's just a little difficult to find the exact distance. And so just have some extra boards on hand for any mishaps. As the piece gets smaller, you want to use something to hold that piece of wood instead of your finger. Doing the little triangles, because I should have done those at the same time that I did these, and I thought, oh, well, I'll just go back and do it. But if I would have done it at the same time, I would have remembered the exact angle of each one of these gray pieces. So after I've struggled a bit, and they're not perfect, but you know, this is a rustic piece of art, I ended up creating a template. You see I traced that hole. So now I'll cut it out and I'll trace it on a piece of paper, and hopefully it'll fit a little better. I want you to notice here that that last little triangle is not a split. I decided to make it one complete triangle that fit in there. So eventually, some of the little triangles got to be too small, and that is the angle that I need to cut. But obviously, I cannot hold that in a miter saw. So I came up with the idea to put another piece of wood in front of it, because that's going to act as my guide. And I'm going to clamp it down into my vise clamp tightly, and then I'm going to use a Ryobi 1 Job Plus that has a flat blade, and I'm going to use that. You see how I'm setting the blade on that other piece of wood, and then it becomes my guide. And it was remarkable how well this worked. Once I had all of my little pieces cut, it was time to glue it up and nail it again. And then I realized that it had a little bit of overhang in some spots and that were going to need to be trimmed, because I'm going to add 1x2s all the way around. So just as I did when I trimmed those tiny triangles, I held down a piece of wood to act as my guide, and then I cut off they were little bitty corners that kind of protruded that needed to be cut. Here's the art turned upside down. I applied 1x2s cut in a miter all the way around, and to create that gap for the panels that I was trying to cover, I used scraps of plywood. In the end, I decided that I wanted to tone down the high contrast. Just for the space that I was working in, that's what I wanted to do. I watered down a little bit of chalk paint, and when I say watered down, I usually just add like a tablespoon in like a quarter of a cup. You can see the little dish I'm using there. And I spread it on with a paintbrush, and then I used like a faux finishing brush to smooth it out. And then you see that's what I'm doing there. And then I wiped it off with a paper towel. Then I was ready to hang it up and cover up those awful panels. And don't forget, you can download the diagram and instructions on the blog post linked here or below, and I'd love to have you subscribe to my YouTube channel and get behind the scenes on Instagram. And don't miss some of my other plywood projects here on YouTube.